Dennis stood up and started pacing the room. Amaka, this wasn't part of the plan. I'm not ready to be a father. This this is too much. Amaka felt her heart sink. What do you mean, Dennis? You said you loved me. You said we would build a future together. Amaka was a young woman with big dreams. She grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other. Life wasn't easy, but Amaka was hardworking and determined to make something out of her life. She believed in love, and when she met Dennis, her whole world changed. Dennis was a charming and handsome man who had a way of making Amaka feel special. He told her sweet words, and for the first time, she believed someone truly cared for her. At first, their relationship was like a fairy tale. Dennis would visit Amaka often, bringing her gifts, spending hours talking about their lives, love, and the future. He told her that one day they would build a family together. Amaka believed every word he said because she loved him deeply. But things took a turn when Amaka discovered she was pregnant. She was filled with mixed emotions, fear, excitement, and worry. However, she didn't know how Dennis would react. Would he be happy? Would he keep his promises? She decided to tell him the news, hoping he would share in her joy. One evening, Amaka invited Dennis over to her small apartment. She was nervous, but she knew she had to tell him. As he sat down, she took a deep breath and said, Dennis, I have something important to tell you. What is it? Dennis asked, smiling warmly. I'm pregnant, Amaka said, her voice shaking. She looked at him, hoping to see happiness on his face, but Dennis's smile disappeared. He looked shocked and didn't say anything for a moment. You are pregnant? He finally asked, his tone uncertain. Yes, Amaka replied. This is our baby, Dennis. We are going to be a family. Dennis stood up and started pacing the room. Amaka, this wasn't part of the plan. I'm not ready to be a father. This is too much. Amaka felt her heart sink. What do you mean, Dennis? You said you loved me. You said we would build a future together. I do love you, Dennis said, avoiding her eyes. But I can't do this. I'm not ready for this kind of responsibility. Dennis, please, Amaka begged, tears streaming down her face. This is our child. Don't walk away from us. But Dennis was already making up his mind. I'm sorry, Amaka. I can't do this. He walked to the door, leaving Amaka standing there, heartbroken and alone. Days turned into weeks, and Dennis never came back. Amaka tried calling him, but he ignored her calls. She sent messages, but he never replied. It became clear that Dennis had abandoned her. Amaka was devastated, but she knew she had to be strong for her unborn child. Months later, Amaka gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. She named her Sophie, a name that symbolized hope and wisdom. Holding Sophie in her arms for the first time, Amaka felt a mix of love and sadness. She promised herself that she would do everything in her power to give Sophie a good life, even without Dennis. Raising Sophie as a single mother wasn't easy. Amaka worked long hours, doing odd jobs to make ends meet. Sometimes she didn't even have enough to eat, but she always made sure Sophie was fed and cared for. Amaka's love for her daughter was unshakable, and Sophie grew up knowing that her mother would do anything for her. As Sophie grew older, she began to notice that her mother worked harder than other parents. She would ask, Mama, where is my father? Amaka would smile sadly and say, Your father is not here, my dear. But don't worry, Mama is here and I will always love you. Sophie didn't ask many questions after that, but she often wondered about her father. Why wasn't he around? Did he not love her? These thoughts stayed in her mind, but she didn't let them weigh her down. Instead, Sophie focused on her studies and dreamed of a better future. One day, when Sophie turned 21, she sat with her mother in their small living room. Mama, she said, I want to leave this town and see the world. I want to make something of myself. Ukamaka looked at her daughter with pride. You can do anything you set your mind to, Sophie. You are smart, you are beautiful and strong. But remember, the world is not always kind. Be careful and always stay true to yourself. Sophie nodded. I will, Mama, I promise. She has already finished her secondary school like 3 years ago. So Sophie decided to move to the city to look for a better opportunities. Okamaka was hesitant at first, worried about her daughter living alone in a big city. But she knew Sophie was determined and she didn't want to hold her back. You are my pride, Sophie, Okamaka said as she hugged her tightly. Go and chase your dreams. I will always be here for you. Sophie smiled through her tears. Thank you, Mama. I will make you proud. As Sophie boarded the bus to the city, Okamaka watched her go with a mixture of sadness and hope. She prayed that her daughter would find happiness and success, even though she knew the journey wouldn't be easy. In the city, Sophie found a small apartment and started looking for work. She faced many challenges, from navigating the crowded streets to dealing with unkind strangers. But Sophie's determination kept her going. She eventually got a job at a local cafe and began to settle into her new life. Life in the city was not easy as Sophie had imagined. The streets were crowded, the noise never seemed to stop, and people moved quickly, as if they didn't have time to care about anyone else. Sophie, determined to succeed, began working at the cafe where she served tea, coffee, and snacks to customers all day. The pay wasn't much, but it was enough to cover her rent for a tiny one-room apartment and keep her going. Sophie was not just working, she was also studying. Back in her hometown, she had passed her exams with good grades, and her dream was to attend university. She knew that education was the key to a better future, but without much money, Sophie realized she had to work extra hard to pay for her school fees. Every morning, Sophie woke up early to prepare for the day. She would go to the cafe where she worked long hours serving customers. Despite the hard work, she never complained. She reminded herself why she was doing it, her dreams, her future, and her mother, who had sacrificed so much for her. After work, Sophie would rush home, quickly eat a simple meal, and then stay up late studying. Her textbooks were old and second-hand, but she made the best of them. Sometimes she would feel tired, but her eyes struggling to stay open. But she never let herself give up. One night, Sophie sat at her small wooden desk, her head resting on her hand as she read a book about accounting. Because she wanted to study at the university, her stomach rumbled. She had skipped dinner because she was saving money. Just a little more, she whispered to herself, I can do this. Her mother, Okamaka, often called to check on her. My daughter, how are you doing? Are you eating well? Are you taking care of yourself? I'm fine, Mama, Sophie would reply, even though she sometimes felt like crying. She didn't want her mother to worry. Back in the village, Okamaka did her best to support Sophie. She did not earn much from her small business, but every time she made a little extra money, she would send it to Sophie. I know it's not much, but use it to buy food or pay your rent, Okamaka would say over the phone. Mama, you're already doing so much for me, Sophie would say. Thank you, I will make you proud. Whenever Sophie received the money, she felt a wave of gratitude. She knew her mother worked tirelessly and she didn't want to waste a single kobo. She used the money wisely, buying only what was necessary. After saving for 2 years, Sophie finally had enough money to apply to a university. The day she received her admission letter was one of the happiest days of her life. She called her mother immediately. Mama, I got in the university. I'm going to the university, she exclaimed, tears of joy running down her face. Praise God! Okamaka shouted on the other end of the phone. I'm so proud of you, my daughter. This is just the beginning. Sophie couldn't wait to start her classes, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. She still had to work to pay for her tuition, books, and living expenses. She decided to continue working at the cafe while attending school. On her first day at the university, Sophie felt nervous but excited. She wore a simple dress and carried her old backpack filled with notebooks and pens. As she walked onto the campus, she saw students from all walks of life. Some arrived in expensive cars, while others, like her, came on foot or by bus. Sophie didn't let herself feel intimidated. She reminded herself that she belonged there, just like everyone else. She attended her first class, taking careful notes and asking questions. Her professors noticed her eagerness to learn and often praised her efforts. Balancing work and studies was exhausting, but Sophie refused to give up. She would wake up before dawn, go to work at the cafe, attend her classes in the afternoon, and study at night. There were times when she felt overwhelmed, but she thought of her mother's sacrifices and her own dreams, which kept her going. One day, her boss at the cafe noticed her dedication. Sophie, you work so hard, he said. How do you manage to do all this and still go to school? Sophie smiled. I don't have a choice, sir. I have to make it work. Her boss admired her determination and gave her a small raise. It wasn't much, but it made a big difference in Sophie's life. She used the extra money to buy better textbooks and save for her exams. One evening, Sophie received a letter from her mother. It was written in her mother's neat handwriting and filled with words of encouragement. My dear, I hope this letter finds you well. I am so proud of everything you are doing. You are my joy and my strength. Keep working hard and trusting in God. Remember, no matter how life gets, you are never alone. Love, Mama. Sophie read the letter over and over, tears streaming down her face. It gave her the strength to keep going even on the toughest days. After years of hard work, Sophie finally graduated from the university with a degree in accounting. Her mother traveled to the city to attend the graduation ceremony. When Okamaka saw Sophie in her graduation gown, she couldn't hold back her tears. You've made me the happiest mother in the world, Okamaka said, hugging Sophie tightly. I couldn't have done it without you, Mama, Sophie replied. The two of them celebrated their achievements together, knowing how much they had overcome to reach that moment. After graduating from university, Sophie was ready to face the next chapter of her life. She knew finding a good job wouldn't be easy, but she was determined to succeed. With her degree in accounting, she started applying to companies in the city. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, but Sophie didn't give up. Every morning, she dressed professionally, carried copies of her resume, and went from office to office, hoping for an opportunity. One afternoon, after another long day of job hunting, Sophie was walking back to her apartment when her phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Hello, good afternoon. Is this Sophie Daniels?" The voice on the other end asked. "Yes, this is Sophie. Who is this, please?" Sophie replied, her heart racing. "This is Mary from Bright Horizons Limited. You applied for a position in our finance department. We would like to invite you for an interview tomorrow at 10 a.m. Can you make it?" Sophie's eyes lit up. "Yes, yes, I can make it. Thank you so much." "Great. Please bring your credentials and come to our office at the address provided in the email we sent to you," Mary said before ending the call. Sophie was so excited she could barely sleep that night. She spent hours preparing for the interview, practicing her answers to potential questions and ironing her best outfit. The next morning, Sophie arrived at the Bright Horizons office. It was a tall building with shiny glass windows, and the receptionist greeted her warmly. "Please take a seat. The HR manager will call you shortly," receptionist said with a smile. Sophie sat in the waiting area, her hands trembling slightly. She whispered a prayer, asking God to help her. When it was her turn, she walked into the interview room with confidence. The HR manager, Mrs. Grace, was a kind-looking woman in her late 40s. She smiled as Sophie introduced herself. "Sophie, tell us about yourself," Mrs. Grace began. Sophie took a deep breath and spoke clearly. I I recently graduated with a degree in accounting. I am hardworking, detail-oriented, and eager to learn. I have experience working while studying, and I believe I can contribute positively to your team." The interview went smoothly, and Sophie felt good about her answers. Mrs. Grace asked a few more questions about her skills and experience, and Sophie responded with honesty and confidence. "Thank you, Sophie. We will get back to you soon," Mrs. Grace said as the interview ended. 2 days later, Sophie received a call from Bright Horizons. She held her breath as she answered the phone. "Hello, Sophie. This is Mrs. Grace. Congratulations, you got a job." Sophie let out a scream of joy. "Oh my God! Thank you so much. I promise I'll do my best." "We are happy to have you in our team," Mrs. Grace said. "Your start date is next Monday. Please come in at 10 a.m. for your orientation." Sophie couldn't wait to share the news with her mother. She called Amaka immediately. "Mama, I got the job," she said, barely able to contain her excitement. "God is good," Okamaka shouted. "I'm so proud of you, Sophie. This is the beginning of great things." On her first day at Bright Horizons, Sophie felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. The office was busy, with people typing on computers and discussing projects. She was introduced to her team and given her own desk. Her supervisor, Mr. Johnson, was a tall man with a serious face but a kind heart. He explained her duties and showed her how to use the company software. Sophie listened carefully and took notes, eager to prove herself. Over the next few weeks, Sophie worked hard to learn everything she could. She stayed late at the office to finish her task and asked questions whenever she was unsure. Her dedication didn't go unnoticed. "Sophie, you're doing a great job," Mr. Johnson told her one day. "Keep up the good work." Hearing those words made Sophie feel proud. She was finally starting to see the rewards of her hard work and determination. One day, as Sophie was working on a financial report, she heard voices near her desk. A man was speaking with Mr. Johnson, and his voice sounded familiar. Sophie looked up and saw a tall middle-aged man in a suit. He had a confident smile and a presence that commanded attention. "This is Mr. Dennis Obina," Mr. Johnson said, introducing the man to the team. "He is one of our top clients and will be visiting us regularly." Sophie felt a strange sensation as she looked at Dennis. There was something about him that seemed familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. She shook it off and returned to her work. Dennis, on the other hand, noticed Sophie immediately. There was something about her face that reminded him of someone he used to know. He couldn't figure out why, but he felt drawn to her. Later that day, Dennis approached Sophie's desk. "Hello, I don't think we've met. I'm Dennis." Sophie stood up and smiled politely. "Nice to meet you, sir. My name is Sophie." "Nice to meet you too, Sophie," Dennis said, his eyes lingering on her for a moment before walking away. Over the next few weeks, Dennis visited the office more frequently. Each time he found an excuse to talk to Sophie. At first, their conversations were brief and professional, but soon they started talking about their lives and interests. "You're very hardworking," Dennis said one day. "It's impressive for someone so young." "Thank you, sir," Sophie replied. "I've had to work hard all my life. My mother taught me to never give up." Dennis smiled. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." As they got to know each other, Dennis couldn't shake the feeling that Sophie reminded him of someone. He didn't realize that the connection he was feeling was deeper than he could imagine. Sophie, too, found herself enjoying Dennis's company. He was kind, supportive, and seemed genuinely interested in her. She appreciated his advice and the way he encouraged her to aim higher in her career. One evening, as they were leaving the office, Dennis offered to give Sophie a ride home. "Are you sure? I don't want to bother you," Sophie said. "It's no bother at all," Dennis replied. "It's on my way." During the ride, they talked about their dreams and struggles. Sophie shared stories about her mother, and Dennis listened with interest. He didn't say much about his own past, but Sophie didn't press him. As time went on, Sophie and Dennis grew closer. Dennis admired Sophie's determination and strength, while Sophie appreciated Dennis's wisdom and support. Neither of them had any idea of the shocking truth that would soon come to light. For Sophie, life seemed to be falling into place. She had a good job, a supportive friend in Dennis, and the love of her mother. She felt like she was finally on the path of the future she had always dreamed of. But life had a way of throwing unexpected surprises, and Sophie's journey was far from over. Sophie's life seemed to be going smoothly. She was adjusting well to her job at Bright Horizon and had gained the respect of her co-workers. Her supervisor, Mr. Johnson, often praised her hard work, and her client, Dennis, had become a close friend and mentor. Dennis, too, had grown fond of Sophie. He admired her intelligence, resilience, and kindness. He often found himself thinking about her even when he wasn't at the office. Despite his growing feelings, he didn't understand why he felt such a strong connection to her. To him, Sophie was just an incredible young woman who had entered his life unexpectedly. One evening, after a long day at work, Dennis invited Sophie out for dinner. "You've been working so hard lately," he said. "Let's grab a meal. My treat." Sophie hesitated. "I don't know, sir. I still have some reports to finish." Dennis laughed. "First of all, call me Dennis. Second, you deserve a break. The report can wait until tomorrow." Sophie smiled. "Okay, Dennis, dinner it is." They went to a quiet restaurant not far from the office. Over plates of jollof rice and grilled chicken. They talked about their lives. Dennis shared stories about his business journey, while Sophie spoke about her struggles growing up with her mother in the village. "My mother is my hero," Sophie said, her eyes shining. "She worked so hard to make sure I had a good life. I wouldn't be here today without her." Dennis nodded, feeling a pang of guilt he couldn't quite explain. "Your mother sounds like an amazing woman," he said. "You are lucky to have her." "Yes, I am," Sophie replied. "But I still wonder about my father sometimes. I've never met him, and my mother doesn't talk about him much. Eunice's heart skipped a beat. He quickly changed the subject. So what are your dreams for the future? I want to make my mother proud, Sophie said. I want to succeed in my career and give her the comfortable life she deserves. Dennis smiled. You're already on the right path. I have no doubt you will achieve great things. As weeks turned into months, Dennis and Sophie's relationship began to deepen. What started as a friendship slowly turned into something more. Dennis found himself looking forward to their conversations and outings, while Sophie began to see Dennis in a new light. He was kind, generous, and always supportive. One evening, Dennis invited Sophie to a business event. It was a networking dinner. He explained, you will meet some important people, and it's a great opportunity for you to grow in your career. Sophie was nervous but excited. She dressed in her best outfit, a simple yet elegant black dress, and Dennis picked her up from her apartment. At the event, Dennis introduced her to his business partners and clients. Everyone was impressed by Sophie's intelligence and charm. You're quite the star, Dennis said as they left the event. You handled yourself beautifully tonight. Thank you, Dennis, Sophie said, blushing. I couldn't have done it without you. Dennis smiled. You don't give yourself enough credit, Sophie. You're an incredible woman. One day, Dennis decided it was time to take their relationship to the next level. He had fallen deeply in love with Sophie and couldn't imagine his life without her. He planned a special evening at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the city. Sophie was surprised when Dennis invited her to such an elegant setting. What's the occasion? She asked. You will see, Dennis said with a mysterious smile. After dinner, Dennis stood up and reached for Sophie's hand. Sophie, he began, his voice filled with emotion. You've brought so much light into my life. You're intelligent, you are kind, and you are beautiful. I want to spend the rest of my life with you. He pulled out a small velvet box and opened it, revealing a sparkling diamond ring. Sophie Daniels, will you marry me? Sophie gasped, her hands covering her mouth. She couldn't believe what was happening. Dennis, I don't know what to say, she whispered. Say yes, Dennis said with a smile. Make me the happiest man in the world. After a moment of silence, Sophie nodded. Yes, Dennis, I will marry you. Dennis slipped the ring onto her finger, and the two of them embraced. It was a moment of pure joy and happiness. Sophie couldn't wait to share the news with her mother. Mama, I am coming home this weekend, she said over the phone. I have someone I want you to meet. Amaka was thrilled. I can't wait to see you, my daughter. Who is this person you are bringing? Sophie laughed. You will see. That Saturday, Dennis drove Sophie to her hometown. As they approached her mother's house, Sophie felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. I hope Mama likes you, she said to Dennis. I'm sure she will, Dennis replied, though he felt a strange sense of unease. When they arrived, Ukamaka was waiting at the door. She hugged Sophie tightly, tears of joy streaming down her face. My daughter, you've grown so much. You look so beautiful. Thank you, Mama, Sophie said. There is someone I want you to meet. Dennis stepped forward, extending his hand. Good afternoon, ma'am. My name is Dennis. The moment Ukamaka saw Dennis, her smile disappeared. Her face turned pale, and she took a step back, her hand trembling. Dennis, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Dennis froze, his eyes widening in shock. Ukamaka, he said, his voice filled with disbelief. Sophie looked at them, confused. Mama, Dennis, what is going on here? Ukamaka turned to Sophie, tears streaming down her face. Sophie, This man, this man is your father. Sophie felt like the ground had been ripped out from under her. What? No, that can't be. That can't be true, she stammered. Dennis was speechless, his mind racing as the truth sank in. Sophie, I didn't know, he said, his voice shaking. I had no idea. Believe me, I had no clue. But Sophie wasn't listening. Her world was spinning, and she felt a sharp pain in her stomach. She collapsed to the ground, clutching her stomach. Mama, she whispered before everything went blank. When Sophie woke up, she was in her mother's small bedroom. Amaka sat beside her, gently stroking her head. Sophie's head felt heavy, and her heart was pounding. Memories of what had happened earlier came rushing back. Mama, Sophie whispered, her voice trembling. Did you really say Dennis is my father? Okamaka's face was filled with sorrow. She nodded slowly. Yes, Sophie, Dennis is your father. Sophie sat up, her eyes wide with disbelief. How? How is this even possible, Mama? You knew all along, and you never told me. Tears rolled down Okamaka's cheeks. I wanted to protect you, Sophie. I thought it was better if you didn't know about him. I never imagined something like this could happen. Sophie felt sick. Her heart raced as she thought about Dennis, her father, the man she had been dating, the man who had just proposed to her. It was too much to handle. I need to get out of here, Sophie said, her voice shaking. She stood up and grabbed her bag. Sophie, please don't leave, Okamaka begged. We need to talk about this. We can figure it out together. But Sophie shook her head. I can't, Mama. I need to be alone. Sophie ran out of the house and into the dark streets. Her mind was spinning. She couldn't believe what she had just learned. How could Dennis be her father? How could the man she had fallen in love with be the same man who had abandoned her mother? She wandered aimlessly, tears streaming down her face. She didn't know where to go or what to do. All she knew was that she couldn't face her mother or Dennis right now. Eventually, Sophia found herself at a bus station. She decided to go to her aunt's house, her mother's younger sister, who lived in a nearby town. She needed time to think, away from everything. Back at Okamaka's house, Dennis was in shock. He couldn't believe what had just happened. The moment he realized Sophie was his daughter, he felt a wave of guilt and shame. He had unknowingly fallen in love with his own child, and the pain of the realization was unbearable. I need to talk to her, Dennis said, pacing the living room. I need to explain everything. Okamaka shook her head. Dennis, you've done enough damage. Sophia needs time. She's hot and confused. Calling her now will only make things worse. But Dennis didn't listen. He picked up his phone and dialed Sophie's number. It rang, and she didn't answer. He tried again and again, leaving messages. Sophie, please, it's Dennis. I'm so sorry. I don't know. Please call me back. We need to talk. For days, Dennis tried to reach Sophie, but she never answered. Each time, his guilt grew deeper, and he felt more helpless. Meanwhile, Sophie stayed at her auntie's place, trying to make sense of everything. Her aunt, Ngozi, noticed that Sophie wasn't herself. She looked pale and tired, and she barely spoke. Sophie, my dear, what's wrong? Ngozi asked one evening. I'm fine, auntie, Sophie said, forcing a weak smile. I just need some time to think. But Sophie wasn't fine. She had been feeling sick for days, nauseous, dizzy, and usually tired. At first, she thought it was because of the stress, but then she remembered something. She was late. Her heart sank as the realization hit her. I can't be, she whispered to herself. The next day, Sophie went to a pharmacy and bought a pregnancy test. Back at her aunt's house, she locked herself in the bathroom and took the test. Her hands trembled as she waited for the result. When the test showed two pink lines, Sophie's heart sank. She was pregnant with Dennis's child, her own father. Sophie didn't know what to do. She couldn't go back to her mother's house, not after everything that had happened. She felt ashamed, confused, and scared. When her aunt asked her what was wrong, Sophie shook her head. I just need some space, auntie. Please don't tell mama where I am. Ngozi agreed, not wanting to pressure Sophie. Back at home, Ukamaka grew more worried each day. Sophie hadn't called, and she had no idea where her daughter was. She tried to stay strong, but the silence was breaking her heart. After 2 days, Ukamaka decided she couldn't wait any longer. She went to Ngozi's house, hoping Sophie might be there. When she arrived, she was relieved to find Sophie sitting quietly in the living room. Sophie, Ukamaka cried, rushing to hug her daughter. I've been so worried about you. Sophie didn't respond at first. She sat stiffly, her eyes filled with sadness. Sophie, please, come home, Ukamaka said gently. I know you are hurting, but we can go through this together. Sophie shook her head. Mama, I can't. I can't face you or Dennis. It's too much. You don't have to face Dennis, Ukamaka said firmly. Just come home. We'll figure everything out. One step at a time. After a long pause, Sophie finally nodded. Okay, Mama, I'll come home with you. That evening, Sophie returned home with her mother. She still felt lost and scared, but being with her mother gave her a small sense of comfort. She knew she had to be strong, not just for herself, but for the life growing inside her. As she lay in bed that night, Sophie thought about everything that had happened. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing: she couldn't let the past define her. After Sophie returned home, the air in the house was heavy with unspoken words. Ukamaka tried her best to comfort her daughter, but Sophie remained quiet most of the time. She still hadn't told her mother about the pregnancy. Her mind was filled with confusion and fear. She didn't know how to move forward with everything that had happened. Sophie spent her days in her room, staring at the ceiling or flipping through old photos. She couldn't bring herself to talk to Dennis or even think about him without feeling a mix of anger, shame, and sadness. Ukamaka often sat beside her, hoping Sophie would open up. One evening, as they sat together, Ukamaka said softly, Sophie, I know this is hard for you, but holding everything inside will only make it worse. Talk to me, my daughter. Sophie looked at her mother, tears filling her eyes. Mama, I don't even know where to start. Everything feels like a bad dream. I understand, Ukamaka replied, holding Sophie's hand. But we can face this together. You are not alone. Sophie hesitated for a moment before finally saying, Mama, I have something to tell you. I'm pregnant. Ukamaka's eyes widened in surprise and she gasped. Pregnant? Sophie, are you sure? Sophie nodded, tears streaming down her face. I took a test. It's true. And it is his child, Mama. Dennis's child. Ukamaka was silent for a moment, processing the news. Her heart broke for her daughter, knowing how much pain she must be feeling. She pulled Sophie into a tight hug. Oh, my child, I'm so sorry you are going through this. But no matter what, we'll get through it. I'm here for you. Meanwhile, Dennis hadn't stopped trying to reach Sophie. He called her every day, leaving messages that went unanswered. He was filled with guilt and regret, knowing that his actions had caused so much pain. One day, he decided to call Ukamaka instead. Okamaka, please. I need to see Sophie. I need to talk to her. She doesn't want to talk to you, Dennis. Okamaka replied coldly. You've done enough damage. Please, Okamaka. Dennis pleaded. I know I've made terrible mistakes, but I want to make things right. I need to apologize to Sophie. I need her to know that I didn't mean to hurt her. Okamaka sighed. I will talk to her, but I can't promise anything. When Okamaka told Sophie about Dennis's request, Sophie shook her head firmly. I don't want to see him, Mama. I can't. I understand, my daughter, Okamaka said gently. But maybe hearing him out will help you find closure. Sometimes facing the person who hurt you is the only way to heal. Sophie thought about her mother's words. Deep down, she knew Okamaka was right. As much as she wanted to avoid Dennis, she also wanted answers. She wanted to know why he had abandoned her mother and why he hadn't been there for any of them these years. After a long silence, Sophie finally said, Okay, Mama, I will see him, but only once. A few days later, Sophie agreed to meet Dennis at a small cafe near their house. She felt nervous and angry as she walked into the cafe and saw him sitting at a table, looking older and more tired than she remembered. He stood up when he saw her, but Sophie didn't return his smile. Sophie, thank you for coming, Dennis said, his voice filled with emotion. I'm not here to talk for long, Sophie said, sitting down. Say what you need to say. Dennis took a deep breath. Sophie, I don't even know where to start. I made so many mistakes in my life, and leaving your mother was the biggest one. I was very young and I was selfish. I, I wasn't even ready to be a father. But that's no excuse. I failed you and your mother, and I will regret it for the rest of my life. Sophie listened silently, her hand clenched into fists. You say you regret it, but do you know what it was like for us? Do you know how hard my mother worked to raise me on her own? And now, after everything this happened, her voice cracked and tears streamed down her face. I know, Sophie, Dennis said, his own eyes filled with tears. I can't change the past, but I want to make things right. I want to be there for you in whatever way you will allow me. Sophie shook her head. It's too late for that, Dennis. You can't just show up and expect to fix everything. I know, Dennis said softly, but I need you to know that I care about you. I didn't know you were my daughter when we met, but now that I do, all I want is to be there for you. Please, Sophie, give me a chance to make amends. After the meeting, Sophie felt more confused than ever. She didn't know if she could forgive Dennis or if she even wanted to. Part of her wanted to move on and never see him again, while another part of her couldn't ignore his sincerity. When she got home, she told Okamaka her mother about the meeting. I don't know what to do, Mama. I am so angry at him, but I also feel sorry for him. Forgiveness is not easy, my child, Okamaka said. But holding on to anger will only hurt you in the end. You don't have to forget what he did, or maybe forgiving him will help you find peace. Sophie thought about her mother's words. She wasn't ready to forgive Dennis yet, but she knew she couldn't carry the weight of her anger forever. She decided to take things one step at a time and focus on taking care of herself. As the days passed, Sophie began to find small moments of peace. She spent more time talking to her mother and leaning on her for support. She also started journaling, writing down her thoughts and feeling to help process everything. Dennis continued to call, but Sophie only answered occasionally. She wasn't ready to rebuild their relationship, but she appreciated his effort to reach out. One evening, as Sophie sat on the porch with her mother, She said, Mama, I don't know what the future holds, but I'm going to do my best for this baby. I'll make sure they have a better life than I did. And I'll be here every step of the way, Ukamaka said, squeezing her hand. For the first time in weeks, Sophie felt a glimmer of hope. She didn't know how her story would end, but she knew she had the strength to keep going. Sophie was beginning to feel like she could move on, though her days were heavy with emotions and thoughts about her pregnancy and Dennis. She focused on small tasks to keep herself occupied. Ukamaka stayed close, watching her daughter with concern, praying silently for strength to carry them both through. One morning, Sophie woke up feeling strange. Her body ached and she felt weak as she walked into the bathroom. She splashed cold water on her face and leaned against the sink, breathing heavily. She was determined to stay strong, even though the weight of everything was overwhelming. As Sophie turned to leave the bathroom, her vision blurred. She suddenly felt a sharp pain in her abdomen. Mama! She screamed. But before Ukamaka could respond, Sophie's legs gave way and she collapsed to the floor. Ukamaka rushed to the bathroom when she heard the loud thud. Sophie! She cried, finding her daughter lying on the floor, blood staining her clothes. Oh my God! Sophie! What's happening? Mama! Sophie whispered weakly, clutching her stomach. It hurts! Ukamaka didn't waste another second. She called for a neighbor to help, and together they rushed Sophie to the nearest hospital. At the hospital, the doctor examined Sophie and ran a few tests. After what felt like an eternity, the doctor came out to speak to Ukamaka. Madam, your daughter has a miscarriage. He said gently, the fall caused complications and we couldn't save the pregnancy. Ukamaka's heart sank. She placed her hand over her face and sobbed quietly. My poor Sophie, she whispered. Sophie was awake when the doctor informed her about the miscarriage. Tears rolled down her cheeks as she stared at the ceiling. She felt an overwhelming sense of loss and guilt, even though she knew it wasn't her fault. Mama, I lost the baby, she said softly when Ukamaka came to the bedside. Oh my child, Ukamaka said, holding her daughter tightly. It's not your fault. Don't blame yourself. We'll get through this together. While Sophie rested in the hospital, Ukamaka decided to call Dennis. Despite everything, he deserved to know what had happened. She dialed his number and told him about Sophie's miscarriage. Dennis was devastated. What? What happened? He said, his voice shaking. How is she now? Is she okay? She's resting, Ukamaka replied, but she's heartbroken, Dennis. This has been too much for her. I need to see her, Dennis said. I'm coming right away. Dennis grabbed his car keys and rushed out of his office. His mind was racing, filled with worry and guilt. He barely paid attention to the road as he sped toward the hospital, desperate to see Sophie. As Dennis drove through the busy street, his mind clouded with thought of Sophie. He replayed their last conversation in his head and regretted all the pain he had caused her. He didn't notice the car in front of him slowing down until it was too late. Dennis slammed on the brakes, but his car skidded and crashed into the vehicle ahead. The impact was so strong that Dennis's car spun off the road and hit a tree. Passerby rushed to the scene and called for an ambulance. Dennis was unconscious, his body battered and bleeding. The paramedics arrived quickly and transported Dennis to the hospital. His condition was critical and the doctors immediately began working to stabilize him. Hours passed and Ukamaka and Sophie returned home after Sophie was discharged. Sophie was weak and quiet, her mind heavy with the loss of her baby. Ukamaka tried to clear her up, but nothing seemed to work. Suddenly, Ukamaka's phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but she answered it anyway. Hello, good evening, ma'am. This is the emergency unit at St. Mark's Hospital. Are you Ukamaka? The voice on the other end asked. Yes, I am, Ukamaka replied, her heart pounding. What's this about? We have a patient here named Dennis Obinna. He was involved in a car accident and you were the last number he called. Can you come to the hospital immediately? Ukamaka's eyes widened in shock. Dennis, an accident. Oh my God. She turned to Sophie, who was sitting on the couch. Sophie, Dennis has an accident and it's very terrible. He's in the hospital. Sophie's heart sank. Despite everything that had happened, she couldn't bear the thought of losing Dennis. We need to go see him, she said urgently. When they arrived at St. Mark's Hospital, the receptionist directed them to Dennis's room. Sophie's hand trembled as she pushed the door open. The sight before her broke her heart. Dennis lay on the hospital bed, his face bruised and his body covered in bandages. He was hooked up to machines that monitored his heartbeat and breathing. His eyes were closed and he looked fragile, a shadow of the strong and confident man she had known. Sophie rushed to his side, tears streaming down her face. Dennis, oh Dennis, she whispered, her voice trembling. She reached for his hand, which felt cold and lifeless. Why did this have to happen? Ukamaka stood at the door, her own eyes filled with tears. She had her share of anger and disappointment towards Dennis, but seeing him like this made her feel pity. No one desired to suffer like this. The doctor walked in and addressed them. Mr. Obinna is in critical condition, he said. We are doing everything we can, but his injuries are severe. The next 24 hours are crucial. Sophie sobbed quietly, her heart breaking all over again. She didn't know how to feel. Anger, sadness, and love all switched inside her, leaving her confused and overwhelmed. Sophie stayed by Dennis's side for hours, holding his hand and speaking to him, even though he couldn't respond. Dennis, you hurt me so much, she said through her tears. But I don't want to lose you. Please fight. Please don't leave me. She cried and cried, her chest heaving with the weight of her emotions. Her mother placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. My daughter, let's leave him to rest. The doctors will do their best. I can't, Mama, she said. I can't leave him like this. Ukamaka sighed and pulled a chair closer to Sophie, sitting beside her. We will stay, Sophie. We will stay as long as you need. As the hours passed, Sophie's tears didn't stop. She couldn't shake the image of Dennis lying there, fighting for his life. Despite all the pain he had caused, he was still her father. She didn't want to lose him, not like this. The hospital room was quiet, except for the sound of machines beeping steadily. Sophie sat by Dennis's side, her eyes red and swollen from crying. Ukamaka was beside her, gently rubbing her back for comfort. The sight of Dennis lying so weak and fragile broke Sophia's heart. She couldn't stop thinking about everything that had happened. For hours, Sophie didn't move from her spot. She held Dennis's cold hand tightly, whispering prayers and silently begging him to wake up. Please don't leave me, she whispered again and again. Suddenly, there was a faint movement. Dennis's fingers twitched slightly, and his eyelids fluttered open. Sophie gasped and leaned closer. Dennis, you are awake, she exclaimed, tears streaming down her face. Dennis's eyes slowly focused on Sophie and then on Ukamaka, who was standing close by. His face was pale and he looked exhausted, but there was a glimmer of recognition in his eyes. Sophie, Ukamaka, he said weakly, his voice barely audible. Yes, we are here, Sophie said, holding his hand tightly. We are right here. Dennis's eyes filled with tears. I'm so sorry, he whispered. I've made so many mistakes. Oh, Kamaka, I failed you. I was young and selfish, and I abandoned you when you needed me the most. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging you, please forgive me. Okamaka's eyes welled up with tears as she listened to Dennis's words. Her heart ached, but she could see the pain and regret in his eyes. Dennis, you hurt me deeply, she said softly, but for the sake of Sophie, I forgive you. Dennis turned his gaze to Sophie, his tears falling freely now. Sophie, I didn't know. I didn't know you were my daughter when I met you. If I had known, I would never have hurt you this way. I'm so sorry for everything I've done. You are my child, my flesh and blood, and I love you more than words can say. Sophie's heart broke as she listened to him. She had spent so many years wondering about her father, and now, in the most unexpected way, she had found him. Despite the pain and confusion, she couldn't deny the bond she felt. Daddy, Sophie said, her voice trembling. It was the first time she had ever called him that. Please stay with me. Don't leave me now. Dennis managed a weak smile, his hand squeezing hers tightly. Hearing you call me daddy, it's more than I deserve. You are such a strong and beautiful woman, Sophie. I'm so proud of you. As Dennis spoke, his voice grew weaker, his breathing became shallow, and his grip on Sophie's hand loosened. Sophie panicked, tears streaming down her face. No, daddy, please don't go, she cried, holding his hand tighter. Stay with me, please. Don't leave me. Dennis looked at her one last time, his eyes filled with love and sorrow. I'm sorry. I love you, he whispered before taking his final breath. The room fell silent. The steady beeping of the machine stopped, replaced by a long, continuous tone. Dennis was gone. Sophie froze, staring at him in disbelief. No! No! Daddy! Please wake up! She cried, shaking his hand. You can't leave me like this, Daddy. Okamaka rushed to her daughter's side, pulling her into a tight embrace. Sophie, my child, I'm so sorry, she said, her own tears falling freely. Sophie sobbed uncontrollably, her cries echoing through the room. Why did he have to leave, Mama? Why now? I didn't even get to know him. Okamaka held Sophie close, stroking her hair and whispering words of comfort. It's okay, my child. Let it out. We'll get through this together. The nurses entered the room to confirm Dennis's passing. They gently asked Sophie and Okamaka to step out so they could prepare his body. Sophie didn't want to leave. She clung to Dennis's hand, her tears falling onto the bed. Come, Sophie, Okamaka said gently, pulling her daughter away. Let's go. Sophie allowed herself to be led out of the room, her heart heavy with grief. She felt like a part of her had been ripped away, and the pain was almost too much to bear. Back at home, Sophie couldn't stop crying. She replayed Dennis's final words in her mind, wishing she could have done more, said more, be there for him sooner. Okamaka stayed by her side, comforting her as best as she could. Sometimes life doesn't make sense, my daughter, Okamaka said softly, but we have to trust that everything happens for a reason. Your father made his mistakes, but in the end, he loved you. Hold on to that. Sophie nodded, though her heart still ached. She knew it would take time to heal, but she was grateful to have her mother by her side. It had been a month since Dennis passed away, but the pain of his loss was still fresh in Sophie's heart. She often sat in the small living room with her mother, staring out the window and thinking about the moment she wished she could have shared with her father. Amaka tried her best to keep Sophie occupied, but the memories of Dennis hung heavy in the air. "Life will get better, my daughter," Amaka said one evening as they sat together. "We just have to keep praying and moving forward." Sophie nodded, but her heart still ached. "I just wish I had more time with him, Mama. There was so much I wanted to ask, so much I wanted to know." Okamaka sighed deeply, placing a comforting hand on Sophie's shoulder. "I know, Sophie, but remember, he loved you. That's what matters the most." One afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Okamaka, who had been cooking in the kitchen, wiped her hands and went to answer. It was a well-dressed man in a suit. He stood outside, holding a briefcase. "Good afternoon," the man said politely. "Is this the house of Madam Okamaka Daniels and Miss Sophie Daniels?" "Yes, it is," Okamaka replied cautiously. "How can I help you?" "My name is Mr. Collins. I'm a lawyer, and I represent the late Mr. Dennis Obina. May I come in? I have some important matters to discuss with you." Okamaka's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure what to expect, but nodded and invited him inside. Sophie, hearing the voices, came out of her room and joined them in the living room. Mr. Collins placed a briefcase on the table and opened it, pulling out several documents. Before his passing, Mr. Dennis Obina made arrangements for his estate. He began. Since Dennis was an orphan and had no immediate family, he chose to will all his assets to the two people he cared about the most, Madam Okamaka and Miss Sophie. Sophie and Okamaka stared at him in shock. "What do you mean, barrister?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. "Dennis owned a successful company, several properties, and a substantial amount of savings." Mr. Collins explained. "In his will, he stated that everything he owned should go to you, Sophie, and your mother. Here are the documents to prove it." He handed them a folder containing the official papers. Sophie's hands shook as she flipped through them, reading the words but struggling to believe them. Dennis had left them everything: his business, his properties, and his wealth. "I can't believe this," Okamaka whispered, tears filling her eyes. "Why would he do this?" Mr. Collins smiled gently. "Dennis felt a deep sense of regret for the way he treated you in the past. He wanted to make amends and ensure that you and Sophie would never have to struggle again." Over the next few weeks, Sophie and Okamaka worked with Mr. Collins to finalize the legal processes. They visited Dennis's company, a thriving business located in the city center. Sophie was overwhelmed by the size and success of the company, but she was determined to honor her father's memory by running it well. With Mr. Collins' guidance, Sophie took over as the company's director. She spent hours learning about the business, meeting with employees, and understanding the operations. Though it was challenging, Sophie felt a sense of purpose. She wanted to make Dennis proud. Meanwhile, Okamaka managed the properties Dennis had left behind, ensuring they were well maintained and rented out. For the first time in her life, she didn't have to worry about money. She could finally relax, enjoy the fruits of their handwork and Dennis's generosity. As time went on, Sophie and Okamaka's lives transformed. They moved into one of Dennis's large beautiful house in the city. The house was beautiful and filled with light, a far cry from the small cramped home they had lived in for so many years. "Mama, can you believe this? This is our new home now," Sophie asked one day as they stood in the living room. "It feels like a dream," Ukamaka replied, smiling, "but we must remember where we came from and remain humble. This is all thanks to Dennis." Sophie nodded. "I'll never forget him, Mama. He changed our lives even after he was gone." Every evening, Sophie and Ukamaka lit up a candle for Dennis and prayed for his soul to rest in peace. They often talked about him, sharing memories and reflecting on the lessons they had learned from his life. Dennis made mistakes, but in the end, he showed us that it's never too late to make things right. Ukamaka said one night, "We must honor him by living good and meaningful lives." Sophie agreed. He may not be here with us, but his love and sacrifice will always be a part of us. And so, they lived happily ever after, with Dennis' memories always in their hearts. The most important lesson in this story is that life is full of second chances, but we must never wait until it is too late to make things right. This story teaches us the importance of forgiveness, responsibility, and love. Dennis's regrets show that abandoning your responsibilities will eventually catch up with you, while Sophie and Ukamaka remind us that forgiveness can bring healing. Always value people in your life, take accountability for your actions, and make amends when you've done wrong. Life is unpredictable. Don't waste your chance to do what is right. And with that, my dear friends, our story comes to a close. But remember, the magic of storytelling lives on, waiting to whisk us away on new adventures, where the wonders of imagination know no bounds. Goodbye for now, and may your dreams be filled with joy, wonder, and endless possibility. Thank you so much for watching. Please kindly comment, like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more interesting stories.